Hi, my name is Bassi and this is a recording of the lead-off that I gave at the Ideas for Freedom conference in June 2014 in a session titled Intersectionality and Marxism. My lead-off has 4 key parts to it. The first part is an introduction to intersectionality and what I think is its elephant in the room. The second part is an introduction to what I want to term intersectional Marxism, specifically a pre-existing, living, breathing intersectional Marxism, in many respects quite independent of a wider discussion and application of intersectionality, but intersectional Marxism as something that we can take forward and develop, if you like, on our own terms by way of a contribution to wider discussions and practices around intersectionality. The third and fourth part are, I guess, my critique really of intersectionality. One, I want to talk about class. So in the third part, I want to talk about class and a defence really of Marx's labour theory of value and the importance of a Marxist understanding of class. And then my second critique, which will be in the fourth part of my lead-off, is around race and the way in which race is used within intersectionality. And a critique really of race reductionism as I see it and the dangers of that for anti-racist politics. And then I will close my talk with some final thoughts. Okay. So, by way of an introduction, I want to touch upon the work of the academic black feminist Patricia Hill Collins. Quite usefully, Patricia Hill Collins makes a distinction between the macro level and the micro level to explain what intersectionality is. So, at the macro level, she says we have race, gender and class, which are, I quote, distinctive yet interlocking structures of oppression. And this metaphor of intersectionality essentially comes in at the micro level. So again, I quote, the metaphor of intersectionality describes micro level processes, namely how each individual and group occupies a social position within interlocking structures of oppression. For Patricia Hill Collins, every individual is simultaneously, I quote, being oppressed and oppressor. So there's a real partnership really of intersectionality with privilege theory that I think is illustrated by this sole point. We are all simultaneously being oppressed and oppressor. And I guess quite significantly, particularly for my later discussion around class, she says we need to, again I'm quoting, we need to support a working hypothesis of equivalency between oppressions. Okay, so I guess just moving forward from this, intersectionality is arguing that wherever there is an oppressive system, be it capitalism, patriarchy, white supremacy, heteronormativity, there are distinct intersections. And on some occasions one might be oppressed, on other occasions one might be privileged. Now we cannot downplay that in intersectionality and its partner privilege theory, the huge elephant in the room, whether they mention it or not, is Marxism. Marxism is the problem. Marxism is crudely understood as economic determinist and class reductionist, Marxist organisations as hostile to anything but class struggle, and Marxist organisations as dominated by white men. And of course we don't want to leave any elephants in our own room at this point, so I think it's really important to emphasise that there have been and there are Marxist organisations who have at best downplayed the struggle against sexism, racism and homophobia, or who have at worst pandered to such oppressions. For instance, there's a really damning history of the forerunner to the Socialist Party, the militant tendency, from the late 70s and 1980s. And I guess this is quite important context really to the roots of intersectionality, the roots of which are within the 60s and 70s new social movements. You know, people within these new social movements were witness to probably some of the more deplorable aspects of a number of key Marxist organisations. Now, the politics of the 60s and 70s new social movements ended up retreating, but they ended up retreating into academia, where they flourished. Also, I have to say, the relatively recent ill-handling and well-publicised ill-handling of a rape allegation case within the Socialist Workers' Party has, unsurprisingly, in my mind, boosted the appeal of intersectionality. For me, intersectionality is a supposed remedy to the limits of former identity politics. It is a remedy to the limits of former identity politics. On the one hand, it's born from a general write-off of Marxism. On the other hand, it's born from a specific critique of feminist women's organisations and anti-racist black organisations. Intersectionality promises a newer, nuanced, reconfigured, intersectional identity politics. It is thoroughly a politics of identity and difference. It stresses the need for the most oppressed to be heard and to lead, and the need for politics to accommodate the full multiplicity of oppressions. So that's part one, my introduction. Moving on then to part two and this idea of intersectional Marxism. So I want to start with two quotes, one from Karl Marx, and it's a sentence from the thesis of Feuerbach. And Marx says, "Human essence is no abstraction inherent in each single individual. In its reality, it is the ensemble of the social relations." Engels, in a letter to Joseph Bloch, says the following: "History is made in such a way that the final result always arises from conflicts between individual wills, of which each in turn has been made what it is by a variety of particular conditions of life. Thus there are innumerable criss-crossing forces, an infinite series of parallelograms of forces which gives rise to the one resultant, the historical event. There is, in my mind, a pre-existing, living, breathing intersectional Marxism, which we can and should take forward and develop." Two examples, coming from two distinct angles actually, two examples of this. One being Marx on anti-Irish racism amongst the English working class. Another example of this that I want to touch upon is the intersectional possibilities that flowed from the 1984-85 miners' strike. So let's start with Marx on anti-Irish racism. A quote here then. "Every industrial and commercial centre in England now possesses a working class divided into two hostile camps, English proletarians and Irish proletarians. The ordinary English worker hates the Irish worker as a competitor who lowers his standard of life. In relation to the Irish worker, he regards him as a member of the ruling nation, and consequently he becomes a tool of the English aristocrats and capitalists against Ireland. He cherishes religious, social and national prejudices against the Irish worker. His attitude towards him is much the same as that of the so-called poor whites to the Negroes in the former slave states of the United States of America. The Irishman sees in the English worker both the accomplice and the stupid tool of the English rulers in Ireland. This antagonism is artificially kept alive and intensified by the press, the pulpit, the comic papers, in short, by all the means at the disposal of the ruling classes. This antagonism is the secret of the impotence of the English working class, despite its organisation. It is the secret by which the capitalist class maintains its power, and the latter is quite aware of this." Now here's the thing. Marxism holds that people's reactionary ideas are shaped by historical conditions and forces of existence, and therefore that people's reactionary ideas can change depending on historical conditions and forces of existence. Take then the example of the 84-85 miners' strike. This class struggle was also, in a particular sense, a thoroughly intersectional struggle in terms of the questioning of traditional gender roles and relations within mining communities, as well as the effect that gay and black solidarity groups had in challenging homophobia and racism. I refer now to an article from Wales Online titled "Miners' Strike, Gay Community When the Gay Community Stood Up for the Miners." And in this article, a South Wales miners' speech particularly a speech by David Donovan, is quoted. And David Donovan, this South Wales miner, says the following during this struggle to the gay and lesbian support the miners group. You have worn our badge, coal not dull, and you know what harassment means, as do we. Now we pin your badge on us. We will support you. It won't change overnight. But now 140,000 miners know that there are other causes and other problems. We know about blacks and gays and nuclear disarmament, and we will never be the same again. The problem is that, for me, is that intersectionality and privilege theory is predicated on an endpoint, an unchanging endpoint status. That is identity. Identity vis-a-vis this intersection between privilege and oppression, rather than a dynamic, ever-evolving understanding of human consciousness through human history. To put it very basically, we can, I believe, be much, much more than our existing identities. So that's part 2 of my talk. Moving on then to part 3 and class. In intersectionality, one moves from a so-called class reductionism, which is seen as intrinsic to Marxism, to what I would call classism. You know, classism to follow in the list of sexism and racism. But class is not another ideology of oppression. Although in sociological terms it might be, but it's not. First and foremost, another ideology of oppression. Class is the way in which we mediate the relations of exploitation in this society. Whereas within intersectionality, both capitalism and class are given quite loose definitions. Capitalism as social, cultural, political, economic relations, class as a cultural construct, to include the economic but differing from simply wage labour. So we have to ask, I think, what do we lose when we redefine what are key Marxist terminology? What do we lose when we are thinking about the nature of exploitation and the means and the agency of resistance? So let's recap Marx's understanding of the terms labour, value and capital. In volume 1 of Das Kapital, Marx distinguishes between labour and labour power. For it's not the labour that capital buys, as in slave society, but our capacity to work, our labour power. The commodity is a thing for sale, and it's defined as possessing both an exchange value, which is its exchange ratio at a certain amount with various other amounts of other commodities, and a use value, its ability to satisfy human wants or needs. A commodity can be our labour power, or it could be a good, it could be a service. The twofold nature of labour in commodities is, on the one hand, concrete labour, that particular activity we do to produce a useful thing, and on the other hand, abstract labour being an expenditure of a quantity of average social labour time. All commodities have value. That's the key thing that they have in common. The value of a commodity is the common property underlying its exchange value. Specifically, the value of a commodity is the average social labour time congealed within it. So where does profit come from? Well, here's the thing. This is an explanation of where profit comes from. Profit is the surplus value that comes from the excess of value added by our labour power, over the value paid out for our labour power as a commodity. It's the excess of value added by workers' labour over the value paid out for our labour power as a commodity. Hence, capital is value used to generate surplus value. Or as Marx puts it, capital is self-expanding value. Now, Marx also makes a distinction between productive and unproductive labour, which actually for most purposes could be and is minor. It's minor, this distinction, simply because exploitation is fundamentally a relation between the whole of the capitalist class and the whole of the working class, not one capitalist and one worker. exploitation lies less in the higher or lower rate of payment for labour power and more in the fact that one class monopolises the means of production and another is compelled to sell their labour power. That said, for Marx, productive workers directly produce surplus value while others do not. For example, unproductive workers, the unemployed, domestic labour, children, old people. However, unproductive workers and indeed unpaid domestic labour, while not directly linked to creating surplus value, serve a critical role for capital in reducing the cost to capital in realising surplus value. For the reason that capital or the state forces unproductive workers to work for a longer time than required to produce the equivalent of our own wages, then we're exploited in much the same way as productive workers. Furthermore, domestic labour, much unproductive labour and even consumption serves to reproduce labour power and thus to reproduce the power that creates the wealth of capitalists in the state. Capital not only gets away with not paying for the full value of the maintenance and reproduction of the working class, but actually it further exploits our own instincts and wages, if you like, for self-preservation. Now, what's the significance of Marx's labour theory of value? Well, there's a big significance here for all of us, committed to the idea that a majority is capable of changing society into one that is much more democratic and far more humane than our existing one. One in which we can conceive of and realise a whole series of new normals enabling full human potentiality and creativity. We actually need to know the following. We need to know who's going to set the tempo and volume of struggles against capital. The importance of Marx's labour theory of value is that it offers us an explanation of profit. And it enables us to predict that when labour is withdrawn, when workers strike, no value is produced. And while his distinction between productive and unproductive labour is a minor one, it remains a useful tool in assessing the degrees of leverage various groups of workers have to disrupt and halt areas of capitalism. Intersectionality and privilege theory offer no such insight or explanation of capitalist exploitation and resistance, but far more problematically, within intersectionality and privilege theory, we're driven away from a Marxist political economy understanding of class and class struggle. Okay, I'm going to move into the fourth part of my talk, and I've titled it Race Reductionism because I think ultimately in a critique of class reductionism, intersectionality slides us into race reductionism and possibly even gender reductionism, but in this lead-up I'm talking about race reductionism. In intersectionality and privilege theory, there tends to be a naturalisation of race so that skin colour becomes an endpoint to our possibilities of human identification. And there also tends to be an emphasis on white supremacy to the exclusion of considering, for example, white-on-white racism. So at this point I want to draw upon the work, I think that the really important work and insight that is offered by into racism, the work of Professor Robert Miles, who's a Marxist sociologist. And he says this about the history of racism and the history of the idea of race. And I'll quote Miles. He says, "For the European, the other has not been created exclusively in the colonial context. Representations of the other have taken as their subject not only the populations of, for example, Africa, the Indian subcontinent and the Americas, but also the populations of different parts of Europe, as well as invasionary and colonising populations, notably from North Africa and the Middle East. Moreover, the other has been created not only externally to the nation state, but also within, most notably in the case of the Jews." So when we read kind of Robert Miles' work, he quite substantially evidences that within Europe, historically, the idea of inferior races, and again he talks about the idea of race, historically in Europe the idea of inferior races has tended to focus on the Irish and the Jews, on the basis of the supposed biological superiority of the Nordic race. He goes on, in talking about racism, to state the following: "What matters is not difference per se, but the identification of difference as significant. From this, he explains that racism entails a process of signification. More specifically, it entails a process of racialisation in which the other is defined somatically in relation to the body, notably by skin colour, for example. And this gives this categorised group of the other negative evaluated characteristics and recognises this group as giving rise to negative consequences. So racialisation defines the other in relation to the body, giving this categorised group negative evaluated characteristics, sees this group as giving rise to negative consequences. These characteristics, these consequences may be biological, they may be cultural, they may be both. Now, intersectionality and privilege theory offers no such explanatory power when we're thinking about racism and the idea of race. But instead, and quite damagingly, I think, for anti-racist politics, race is reduced into a naturalised identity. So we move away from the construction of race into taking it as a given. And I think that is really rather harmful, actually, in terms of moving forward politically, and particularly in the struggle against racism. Okay, so that's all 4 parts of my talk done. So I started with an introduction into intersectionality and the elephant in the room. I moved on to discuss this notion of intersectional Marxism with a case really to really develop a pre-existing, living, breathing intersectional Marxism on our own terms. I then moved on to 2 critiques of intersectionality, one based on class, the other I titled Race Reductionism. So now I guess I want to offer some final thoughts. And it is worth saying that my lead-off was very much based on my thoughts that came from reading the key literature that is out there. Now, I want to offer some final thoughts very much based on my observations of intersectionality in practice, particularly as I've observed it through student activist milieus. So I attended a while ago, I think it was on the 1st of May of this year, the launch event of the Sheffield Free University. In particular, I went to a session titled Intersectionality. Not insignificantly, it was led by a black woman. The audience was white, with the exception of me. And during the latter stages of the session, the black woman who was leading the session brought up a particular image that was used in advertising the launch event of the Sheffield Free University. And the image that she problematised was of South African school students holding a free education placard. And the reason why she problematised this image was that it was because it was appropriated, insensitively appropriated by the organisers of Sheffield Free University. It was an insensitive, inappropriate, thoughtless appropriation of an image of young people in South Africa holding this free education placard. And the audience responded by looking quite worried, ashamed even, and troubled that some of them in particular who had happened to have put the image up had been guilty of such an insensitive appropriation. I responded by saying the following to the woman that problematised this. I said, look, we should absolutely be sensitive. We should absolutely be sensitive to the spatial and temporal specificities of particular images and of particular experiences, if you like. But I said the way in which she describes this image, which I hadn't seen at the time, actually I think there was something universal in the image as well. And she looked at me, the black woman leading the session, and she said, what could I possibly think I had in common with this image? And she said it with a hint of disdain. And I replied, well, the universal struggle for free education, for starters. Perhaps also the universal struggle for free healthcare. The universal struggle for independent labour movements, and so on. And she didn't come back. She didn't look happy, but she didn't come back on me on that point. I want to talk about experience, okay? Because this plays a big part in discussions in practice around intersectionality and privilege theory. And I want to throw in a couple of brief quotes from Karl Marx. Marx says ideas are the conscious expression, real or illusionary, of our actual relations and activities, because social existence determines consciousness. So in this sense, ideas and experience can be understood as, on the one hand, unique, personal, insightful and revealing, and on the other hand, as thoroughly social, partial, mystifying, itself the product of historical forces of which we may know something little or nothing about. Now, intersectionality and privilege theory in practice place a huge emphasis on experience and this notion of authenticity, to the point of, I think, narcissism and narcissistic anger. Now, I'm a socialist, and I think this narcissism and narcissistic anger is at the expense of values that I hold really dear to me. Values such as empathy and intersubjectivity and connection and universalism. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.